On the 25th of May, the European Chemical Society held the morning session of its workshop on the element of phosphorus, titled "The Role of Chemicals in Our Daily Life, the Element of Phosphorus, Feeding the World and Beyond," at the European Parliament. The workshop was chaired by MEP Maria Spyraki, as well as Scientific Chair Evamarie Hey-Hawkins. MEP Spyraki and Senior Policy Officer Christos Vasilakos introduced the European Parliament's priorities on chemical policy, such as the CLP regulation, which stands for Classification, Labeling and Packaging, as well as the revision of the REACH regulation, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals. Floris Rutjes, EuChemS President, introduced the wide variety of speakers. The first speaker was Nicola Armaroli, who introduced the EuChemS Periodic Table. He talked about how this document developed, what does the colors and change of this unique periodic table represent, how does this convey the message of sustainability and element scarcity. In addition, he also briefly summarized the previous workshops in this series. As the EuChemS Periodic Table is a living document, these workshops shape how it continues to develop. Nicola's presentation is available in the description on this video or can be accessed on the following QR code and link. Our second speaker was Alessandra Quadreli. She talked about the planetary boundary framework from a chemistry point of view. In her presentation, she connected the EuChemS Periodic Table to the complex notion of planetary boundaries. She continued to discuss the role of phosphorus in the planetary boundary system by investigating its Anthropocene uses, as well as its future supply and demand. Her presentation will be available as well in the description or on the link or QR code here. Our third speaker was ESPP, European Sustainable Phosphorus Platform President Robert van Spingelen. He introduced his organization as a non-profit dealing with phosphorus policy. His presentation concerned the role of phosphorus in the European Union's agricultural policy. He extended upon the European Nutrient Policy Framework, its connections to the Green Deal, the role of phosphorus recycling, and last but not least, he elaborated on ESPP's upcoming dossier, which concerns the element of phosphorus in connection with the European Union's upcoming Critical Raw Materials Act. Just like the other presentation, his presentation is available in the description or on the QR code or the link here. The morning session in the Parliament ended with a panel discussion where members of the morning session, members of the afternoon session, as well as the audience could engage in dialogue regarding phosphorus. Following this discussion, our speakers moved to EuChemS premises. We are delighted to invite you to review the presentations of the morning sessions available on this link, as well as in the description, or to continue watching this video to see a recording of the entire afternoon section.
Welcome back. This morning we were at the European Parliament, and now during the lunch break we moved to the EuChemS offices. And on my left-hand side, for those of you who haven't been here this morning, is the president of EuChemS, and he is going to lead the discussion in the afternoon. I will be chairing the lectures, and our first speaker this afternoon is Dana Quadreli, who I can already see. So let me briefly introduce her. So Dana Quadreli is the Research Director of Food Systems at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. She leads and undertakes international and national research projects on sustainable food and phosphorus futures all around the world. And I should mention that in 2008, she co-founded the Global Phosphorus Research Initiative, a platform to undertake research policy and public engagement to ensure food systems are resilient to the emerging global challenge of phosphorus scarcity. And this is also going to be part of our talk today. Dana, we are very, very happy to have you with us because it's already very late at Sydney.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate the invitation to be here on such an important topic, and phosphorus always keeps me up late at night. So what better way to talk about it with friends? So I will share my presentation now. Is that good for everyone?
Yes.
Fantastic. So this first talk of the afternoon is going to really cover how we are heading into a global food crisis if we don't pay serious attention to phosphorus accessibility and security, and transform the way we use and manage this element. And the good news, of course, is that there are huge opportunities to mitigate these risks, but it will take a concerted effort of all stakeholders around the phosphorus value chain. So before going any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal owners and custodians of the land where I'm sitting now in Sydney, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And as a phosphorus researcher, I also acknowledge their 60-odd thousand years of practice that has enabled phosphorus to sustainably flow through the landscape, particularly through their use of fire to sustain their own food systems. So I'd also like to acknowledge my many international phosphorus collaborators over the past decade or two, including those in the current EU RECAP project, where we have 36 partners and sorry, that's my Siri. We have 36 partners, and we're literally, as we speak, training up the next generation of phosphorus professionals who are hopefully going to be in positions of power and influence to tackle some of the very issues that we're talking about today. So we've talked a bit today, this morning already, about how phosphorus underpins food security. What we're seeing is in discussions around the Sustainable Development Goal of zero hunger, we're still missing phosphorus on the agenda and other related global agendas. But as we know, without phosphorus, we can't produce food. We're not talking about producing smartphones and batteries. This is our fundamental ability to sustain ourselves, our very species, into the future. So there's always going to be a global demand for phosphorus. We've already heard a little bit this morning already about phosphate rock, so I won't cover too much. Maybe just to mention, for those who don't know, that there are a lot of uses of phosphorus, but about 90% of that, of phosphate rock, sorry, 90% of that use is roughly for food production, so mostly fertilizers and a small amount for animal feeds. It's really useful to step back, though, and look at the past 200 odd years or so of where we've sourced our phosphorus from in the global food system. And we can see that, you know, hundreds of years ago, farmers just used locally available organic materials like manure and crop residues. And indeed, in parts of Asia, for thousands of years, they've been using human excreta. I think Robert was mentioning this morning, showed some great pictures. And it's just that tiny white line there because volume-wise, it's not as big as the others. But due to repeated famines and soil degradation, particularly in Europe, there was a search for external sources of phosphorus from the food system. And that's around when guano was discovered. So that's fossilized bird and bat droppings. And it was off the coast of Peru and in the Pacific Islands. And there was guano mania, where countries were scrambling to lay claim to these tiny little islands and their very rich phosphorus deposits. And very soon they were tapped into, and all the good, easily accessible guano was used up. So what you can see in this diagram is a tiny black line that's actually a little blip. It's a little peak guano curve. And phosphate rock was, you know, discovered roughly around the same time, but it was really only until the post-World War II period, around the Green Revolution, that we saw that great acceleration that Alessandra was telling us about, of phosphorus demand and hence production to keep up with nitrogen production and other demands. And phosphate rock at the time was seen as a cheap and straightforward and plentiful source of phosphorus, which of course it was at the time. But what it means is that other forms of phosphorus were dropped off in favor of phosphate rock. And we've reached a point now where this huge population we have now is essentially dependent on this one main source of phosphate rock. There are a lot of uncertainties into the future, but we know if we continue on the path we're on, we're going to see a huge increased demand growth. And I think Chris Lawson will talk a bit more about this, whether it's population growth, the fact that we've had changing diets, eating more meat and dairy. There's huge parts of particularly sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia that have phosphorus deficient soils where farmers currently can't afford fertilizers. So it's this silent demand for phosphorus. And there's, of course, all these other non-food uses that others are talking about today, electric vehicle batteries. We saw what happened in 2018 with a spike in biofuels demand. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the current phosphorus challenge. As many of you would know, in 2008, we saw a 800% price spike. There were many causes, including the US ethanol policy of 2007, because biofuel crops require a lot of fertilizers to grow. But it had devastating consequences around the world. There were farmer riots and suicides from Haiti to India. In Australia, we had a Senate inquiry into why Australian farmers couldn't get their hands on fertilizers. But it also acted as a wake-up call to show just how vulnerable our global food system is to even a short-term disruption in the supply or the price of phosphate. So the question remains on everyone's lips, is there a looming phosphorus crisis? And if so, when? Is it 30 years, 300 years? Are we already in it? What will be the cause? To what extent? What are the implications and for whom? People often ask, how much phosphate have we got left and how many years? It's a really simplistic question to ask that can't be answered simply. But from a food security and sustainability perspective, one of the really important first things to remember is that measuring the tonnes in the ground is not the same as measuring the tonnes accessible in a farmer's hand on the field. And that's because there's a whole bunch of bottlenecks that are constraining the amount of phosphorus we can actually get into the food that we eat. So Alessandra mentioned this morning that phosphorus is the 11th most abundant element in the Earth's upper crust. Doesn't seem scarce, but in defining phosphate rock resources and reserves, which again, I assume Chris will go into later, there's aspects that make it feasible or not feasible around whether it's concentrated enough or economically and technically feasible, but also questions around whether the phosphate is even physically accessible. We're starting to look under the seabed in marine protected zones off the coast of Namibia. Is this what we want to be doing? Or some of that phosphate is in war zones or politically sensitive risky areas where businesses may not want to invest in new mines in those areas to bring that phosphate online. And we also know that even if farmers can afford that phosphate and they get it onto their fields, plant roots only take up a tiny fraction of the phosphate that's applied, and a lot of it will get bonded to soil and or washed off potentially into our waterways, where we know it can cause nutrient pollution and algal blooms. And then, of course, there's all of the waste and losses that we currently have from mine to farm to fork. We have about 80% that's getting lost. So it really leaves us with a much smaller fraction from a food security perspective. But perhaps one of the most concerning aspects, which others have touched upon, is the location of these remaining phosphate reserves. Because again, remembering that while all farmers in the world need access to phosphorus, just 5 countries control 85% of the world's remaining phosphate rock reserves. And as you can see from the picture, Morocco alone controls 3/4 of that, including the deposits in Western Sahara, which is a contested area. The other big players are China, Russia, the US, but their reserves are much smaller and dwindling. Some studies suggest that Morocco's share over the coming decades could increase to upwards of 90% as we see other reserves in other regions dwindle. So what this means is that whether we're talking about Europe or Australia or India, almost all other countries are dependent on phosphate imports and hence vulnerable to these price fluctuations that we've seen and supply disruptions. It's really interesting to look at the global price of phosphate over the past 50 years. We've had 3 major price spikes. As you can see, the last 2 of them have been since 2008, and there's been a lot of price volatility that we hadn't seen prior to that. We've already talked a little bit about the cocktail of factors that led to the 2008 price spike. But little did we know 2 years ago or 3 years ago that this COVID pandemic would also disrupt our phosphorus supply chains in such a dramatic way. So it caused a 400% price spike because China currently produces about 40% of the world's phosphate annually on the market. And a third of that phosphate, of the mines, are in Hubei province, where the epicenter of the COVID pandemic started. So it really disrupted those phosphorus supply chains. And again, we saw a whole bunch of other factors around natural gas prices soaring, China and Russia imposing more export bans and tariffs, and then, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which affected phosphate markets and many other food and energy related markets. So what does this mean for the future of phosphorus security? In terms of the long-term outlook, what we can say is that the era of cheap phosphate is coming to an end. We've used up the good stuff, as we do with all non-renewable critical resources. We get the easily reachable stuff first. So regardless of when the exact crunch point is, and as many of you know, there's certainly lots of figures based on very different assumptions about when that will be, we know that high-grade phosphate reserves are becoming increasingly physically scarce. What's left in the ground is lower quality, lower concentration. It's harder to reach. There's more waste being generated, more energy to mine, transport, process, and the costs are going up. And this is a big deal for the world's farmers who are going to produce our food. In the short term, we can say that long before those global reserves are likely to be exhausted, we're going to see more short-term disruptions and price spikes. We just don't know when and from what exact cause, but there could be, again, more geopolitical, economic, or even environmental causes. So this means that in the short and long term, we're likely to see more disruptions where reliable supply might be insufficient to meet demand due to a range of potential unknown or known factors. So coming back to farmers again, farmers need access to affordable fertilizers to grow the food that we need to eat to survive, and also to support their livelihoods and their businesses. Yet almost 1 billion farmers today can't access fertilizer markets. For example, many African farmers in landlocked countries can pay up to 2 to 5 times more than European farmers for fertilizers due to those high non-market value costs, so that high transport costs, the railroad, port duties, handling, and sometimes even corruption. And we know that the price spikes and sustained high prices will and is pushing these vulnerable communities into even higher states of poverty and food insecurity. They're usually the same farmers who have nutrient deficient soils, who are vulnerable to climate extremes, etc. But what we're also seeing is that it's seeing increasing vulnerability to farmers and farming communities in high income regions like Europe and Australia. Last year, we heard from the the president of the World Farmers Organization, saying that the main talk amongst farmers in the world right now is the availability and price of fertilizers. So we need to be paying attention to our end user. But whose responsibility is phosphorus security? Despite these huge and varied dimensions of phosphorus vulnerability that we've just gone through, there's still a serious lack of international and national policies, guidelines, organisations responsible for ensuring long-term availability and accessibility of phosphorus for food production. And certainly I'd say Europe is in the lead in that regard, but there is still so much more to be done. We often hear the market will take care of it. It's just a supply-demand issue. It will correct itself. And certainly the market is currently governing phosphorus by default. but we also know that the market has failed us in terms of externalities, and it is not sufficient to ensure equitable, timely and sustainable management of a resource that is essentially a public good. It's not a private good. So the governance of phosphorus is fragmented between many different sectors and stakeholders. So it's a bit ambiguous who should be responsible. Is it the mining and fertilizer companies or governments, investors and donors, farmers, food retailers, food consumers, waste service providers, NGOs or the UN? And the answer, of course, is yes, it's all of these stakeholders. It can only happen if there is an integrated, targeted approach. So how do we move towards phosphorus security? Well, our universal definition, if you like, of phosphorus security anywhere in the world is that all farmers can access sufficient phosphorus, that our soils are fertile and agriculture is productive, that people have healthy diets and balanced phosphorus intake, and that our rivers, lakes and oceans are clean and free from nutrient pollution. Easy peasy. So how do we then implement it? We need all those stakeholders we talked about earlier to implement these. And we've been working with national stakeholders in various countries to deliver on this. And our most recent work is in the UK with the Refocus project, where we co-developed with 60 UK food and phosphorus stakeholders the UK's first phosphorus transformation strategy. So you don't need to read all the detail here. I can send you the report later. But basically, we first helped or worked with stakeholders to articulate their vision of a sustainable phosphorus future system, some 20 years into the future. And for them, it was ranging from a viable and circular economy through to that it's self-sufficient, because at the moment, the UK is almost entirely dependent on imported fertilizers. They also articulated what the current state of play is, the current risks, what are the current drivers and pressures that they're facing. And then the really important bit in the middle is how do we get from where we are now to where we want to go? And again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but the important thing is, while technology and innovation is, of course, at the heart of this, it's only one of the transition pathways. We need to pay attention to taking an integrated, coordinated approach to policy and governance, to new independent research and knowledge, to markets and incentives, to community engagement and awareness, and to integration between these different pathways and creating new networks. So coming back now to some of the numbers, because everyone wants to know, can we feed the world with phosphorus efficiency and recovery? So here you can see a business as usual curve for phosphorus demand into the future. If we were to feed 10 billion people using current practices, and then the phosphate rock curve, which diversifies away from phosphate rock. And the good news is that we can meet that demand by investing in a whole suite of a whole range of portfolios of efficiency that you can see in the blue, and recycling or reuse that you can see in the red. So all of those blue measures will basically bring the global phosphorus demand right down through, for example, investing in efficiency during how we mine and produce fertilizers, which I think Chris is going to talk a little bit more about later. We know there are huge gains to be made in agriculture, from tapping legacy phosphorus to other opportunities. Reducing food waste in the value chain also reduces phosphorus waste. Changing diets towards more phosphorus efficient, low phosphorus footprint foods. And then on the reuse side, you can see in the pink, tapping into any and all potentially viable organic waste sources, from food waste to human excreta to manure. And there's at least 70 different technologies and practices, or probably many, many more out there already. But the point is, these technologies and practices don't implement themselves. They need to be supported and stimulated through policy instruments like regulations and targets and incentives and coordination. So imagine a Europe that has actually diversified local phosphorus markets to include renewable fertilizers in a serious way that could be drawn upon in times of disruption. Compare this to energy. We have energy stockpiles, we have renewable energy markets, but for phosphorus, something that's essential for food production, we have no stockpiles and no alternatives at scale that we need. Lots of pockets of innovation. So by investing in renewable fertilizers, for example, from local sustainable sources, we can not only reduce nutrient pollution, reduce all that organic waste going to landfill and the methane it produces, reduce waste treatment and disposal costs, but we can reduce the dependence of countries on imported fertilizers, secure those fertilizer supplies for farmers and buffer against those price spikes and export bans, reduce the mining of this non-renewable resource, support food security, and of course, increase local employment in the process. So just a quick word on creating a viable circular phosphorus economy, because rightly so, circular economy is the the term of the moment. But I think as it relates to nutrients, it's still quite in its infancy. And what we're often seeing is that circular nutrient economy is incorrectly equated with just recycling. And we know that if we want to create a really viable circular phosphorus economy, we need to pay special attention to the circular markets across that value chain and to the integrated flow of knowledge between stakeholders and joined up governance so it's not so fragmented. And what I mean by that, for example, with circular markets, if you were a waste manager looking to recover phosphorus from organic wastes, or a technology developer, you want to first think about who is your target end-use market. Is it the high-end tomato indoor horticulturalists that Alessandra was talking about in the Netherlands? Or is it livestock producers to going into animal feed? And who's going to sell or retail your product? Are you selling directly as an intermediate product to the fertilizer industry to blend with their phosphate rock-based fertilizers? Or is it going to be a product that's sold on supermarket shelves or hardware stores? What do you need to know about your end user to better design your product? For example, if it is this high-end indoor tomato horticulturalist, perhaps they're using liquid fertilizer. So maybe you need to make sure your product is in that same form. And who's the competition on the market? And what's the price point you should be thinking about? And what does your end-use market need to know about your product? For example, do they need quality assurance that it's plastic and pathogen-free so that they can sell to their export markets, for example? We need to do a lot more digging. And on the governance side, we need to think of big sticky questions like, how can we integrate policies that incentivize both phosphorus removal and phosphorus recycling? Because what we've seen in the past is that those that just focus on phosphorus removal to prevent water pollution might recover phosphorus in a form that is not cost effective or viable to convert into a fertilizer. It might be absorbed to alum, for example. And these bigger questions of who is the guardian responsible for overseeing all parts of this circular nutrient economy? Who's coordinating all of this? So what's stopping nutrient reuse happening at scale? Maybe one part of this is the informality of the sector historically. And maybe we need to stop talking about things like sludge and biosolids and start using more attractive, marketable language like renewable fertilizers. The fertilizer industry operates in a commercial context, and if they're going to use these raw organic materials, they need reliable supply chains in high volume. And we are hearing this, the same thing from fertilizer industry stakeholders that we've engaged the past decade across Australia, the UK, Malawi, Sri Lanka. For example, in Malawi, where there's one main fertilizer company and product manager, he's been approached by various NGOs from the sustainable sanitation sectors, offering some tons of composted excreta, for example. And he just says, don't talk to me about a few tons of excreta. Come back when you've got 100 tons a day, and then we'll talk business. So it's an economy of scale issue. In Sydney, we were hearing from frustrated farmers saying waste contractors are dumping free compost at our farm gate and wondering why we aren't using it. But we don't have the machinery to spread it. While in Sri Lanka, when we were talking to the fertilizer industry about their perceptions of the use of human excreta as a raw material, they said, oh, we're not worried about the ick factor. That's just a marketing issue. So we can see from these examples that instead of waste managers spending millions or billions recovering nutrients from waste and then searching for a market as an afterthought, we need to talk to farmers and these other circular economy stakeholders about their needs and preferences up front. Otherwise, this may continue to fail and not be able to be scaled up. So just coming to the last slide, key features of renewable fertilizers. And this is thinking not just from a farmer perspective, but perhaps from the fertilizer industry and from a national food security perspective. We want to make sure that these products have a reliable supply on the market, that they're affordable, they're competitive, that they're appropriate and in a spreadable form that the end-use market can actually use. Of course, that they're bioavailable for crops and in high plant available concentrations, that they're non-toxic, that they're sourced from diverse raw materials to buffer against supply chain shocks. Because of course, that's not just about imported fertilizers, as we've seen from mad cow disease, which I think Robert or William mentioned this morning, that can remove one supply stream offline very quickly. So ideally, they need to be substitutable and ethically sourced and environmentally produced and provide co-benefits so we can co-recover not just nutrients, but energy, other minerals and waters from the same source. So who is going to take the next step? Just going to leave you with that question. Thank you very much.
Dana, very interesting talk and very, very important questions that you have addressed. And if anyone of the audience has questions, please put them in the chat so that Dana can answer them online. And of course, if you have questions for us later for the discussions, please also include them in the chat so that Floris can pick them up and then discuss them with us. So thank you again, Dana. I would like to go on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Chris Lawson. Is he already there?
Hello.
Hi, Chris. So Chris Lawson is head of fertilizers at CRU Group since 2014. He's leading a global and market-leading team of 30 analysts and reporters. And furthermore, he oversees the fertilizers business unit. He's based in New York, and that is why it's very early for him in the morning. So thank you for joining us at this early time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining, and thank you to the European Chemical Society for inviting us along and thinking of us here. It's a pleasure to be here presenting to you today. I've literally just come back from Europe. The International Fertilizer Association had their conference in Prague over the last few days. So I've just flown back to the US from following that. So it's been very interesting to speak with lots of fertilizer market participants after what has been a pretty volatile and wild last couple of years on that market. So I'm just going to share my screen and attempt to get this right, because just for people that don't know CRU, we're a company that's headquartered in London. We're active across the mining, metals and fertilizer space, more specifically work in fertilizer markets, steel markets, aluminium markets and base metals. So we provide business intelligence across those different markets. We also host varying different events, and yeah, we do consulting as well. So yeah, the company is a little under 400 people, been around for over 50 years. So we're a well-respected kind of research house in the commodity space. So today I'm going to talk through kind of the dynamics of the phosphate market and try and provide a bit of context as to how the market works, and just kind of go back to basics and thinking about how the market is going to evolve in the future, particularly in the context of some of the challenges that Dana has highlighted in her great presentation there. So I'll give a very kind of basic 101 of the phosphate value chain, take a look at some of the statistics around phosphate rock production and demand and trade flows, look at how prices have evolved over the last couple of decades, and then talk a little bit about, again, how some of these new markets for phosphates are going to evolve. And again, summarizing and putting that into context as to what all this means with the phosphate kind of resource and reserves that we have. So let's start looking at the overall fertilizer value chain here. We can see here kind of fertilizers is typically broken down into three major kind of macronutrients, I guess. You've got nitrogen, which is essentially a product or derivative of hydrocarbons at the moment. So ammonia is the intermediate, and we see that produced into downstream fertilizers such as urea and ammonium nitrate. Sulfur, which is a byproduct for the most part from oil and gas production. That's a key raw material in producing phosphate fertilizers. Sulfur is converted to sulfuric acid, reacted with phosphate rock to produce a phosphoric acid, and then we go downstream and produce lots of different types of granular phosphate fertilizers. Then potash or potassium is the last of the bunch there, and again, that's another really important mineral resource that is a key kind of macronutrient. So to dig into the phosphate value chain a little bit more, as I just said, phosphate rock is mined out of the ground. It is beneficiated to a kind of marketable concentrated product that is then typically reacted with sulfuric acid to produce phosphoric acid. And that phosphoric acid is then reacted or combined with ammonia, so one of those nitrogen intermediate, to then produce ammoniated phosphate fertilizers. That phosphoric acid has numerous other uses as well in industry, whether that be for metal treatment, whether that be for downstream phosphate salt production that's in food preservatives. It can also be used as a kind of additive in animal feed. So there's lots of different uses for phosphates outside of fertilizers as well, and all of that needs to be considered, and that's something that we're talking a lot with the market and our clients about at the moment as well, in light of the rise of electric vehicles and the increased market share that we see in that of lithium-ion phosphate batteries. So I'll touch on that a little later in this presentation and provide some context around that. So if we look at the right of this slide here, you can see of around 200 million tons of phosphate rock production. Around 75% of that goes into the phosphoric acid process. The rest goes into some of the downstream fertilizers such as single superphosphate and triple superphosphate. And then again, when we look at that phosphoric acid, most of that is going into phosphate fertilizers, and around 10% is going to those feed and industrial uses. So hopefully that just helps to provide a kind of step back and a back to basics of phosphates. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to kind of try and revert back to that kind of upstream phosphate rock product, because again, in the context of what we're talking about here and phosphate production and reserves, that is, I think, the most simple and easy way to understand this. As Dana talked about before, she gave some good overviews of how phosphate rock is mined. So we see that around 95% of phosphate rock that's mined around the world is through the marine and sedimentary deposits. So that's predominantly what you see in Morocco, in Florida, in the United States. Lots of the reserves in China as well are these sedimentary deposits. So that is first and foremost, the main source of phosphate rock in the world. At CLU we look a lot at mining economics and production costs. So we've got some really good data and statistics on how much it costs to pull these types of minerals out of the ground, and how much it costs to build these mines as well. The capital requirements of building a phosphate rock mine aren't huge, and if you compare that to something like building a copper mine, they're not all that high, and that's particularly the case in these sedimentary deposits. Operational costs as well can be relatively low. So we see in some instances Morocco is the lowest, or the country with the highest level of reserves, and a big focus point for the phosphate industry, they can essentially mine rock out of the ground and beneficiate that and get that to their downstream production facilities or onto a boat to ship somewhere else. They can do that for anywhere between kind of $30 and $40 per ton. So it's relatively cheap. If we shift our attention to the left here, igneous rock deposits make up around 4 to 5% of global production. These are much more capital intensive parts of the market. They're a lot more expensive, but you're getting a much higher quality rock out of this as well. You have a lower in situ P2O5 level, but you have generally a lot fewer impurities within the phosphate rock, and you can essentially extract more out of that concentrate when you're using it downstream. The guano deposits are a much smaller piece of the pie at the moment. And again, they're relatively low capex operations and can be relatively cheap to pull out of the ground as well. But as Dana pointed out, that they're a relatively small part of the whole production piece right now. So hopefully that gives some context as to the kind of geology of phosphate rock, and again how this is mined. If we look at the production breakdown from a kind of geographic point of view and how this has evolved over the last kind of 25 years or so, we're looking at history, but we're also looking at our 5-year forecast here. So you can see here, there's, you know, in 2022, there was around 200 million tons of phosphate rock that was produced. That was significantly lower than what we'd mined in 2021, and that was a result of low demand for phosphate fertilizer following the big price spike that we've seen. And we'll talk a little bit about pricing dynamics in a few slides' time. But let's concentrate on the geographic makeup here. You can see that between 2000 and 2015, China essentially almost quadrupled its production of phosphate rock and downstream phosphates. They invested and over-invested in capacity for mining, but also downstream phosphates. They did that across many different commodity chains. Phosphate is no great exception here. So we saw that rise of China to 2015, and they are now starting to pull back a little bit. There are some concerns around the amount of resource life they have left there. But typically in China, we see them essentially consuming way too much phosphate fertilizer, and the government recognizes that, and there are directives for them to reduce that. And they're looking to essentially be much more efficient in the way that they're mining and consuming phosphates going forward. So you can see their share of production or total production is forecast to go down over the coming 5 years. We've seen Morocco pull more out of the ground as well, and you can see here on the right of the chart that we have the rise of Middle East and North Africa is what we mean by MENA here. So Morocco is starting to pull more out of the ground. They had a big kind of revision of their overall industrial strategy in 2008, and we see OCP, the Moroccan phosphate mining company, investing heavily in building more mining operations and also downstream operations. So in the dark blue there, you see Morocco, the amount increasing quite a lot. In the US, it's kind of the opposite. We've seen them contract in terms of their overall volumes and share of the market. It is not a particularly attractive industry in the US phosphate mining and downstream production. There are declining reserves there. They are less competitive when we look at the cost curve, but there are also lots of pressures that phosphate rock miners are facing in getting permitting to build mines. Lots of the phosphate in the US is mined in Florida. The population of Florida is increasing very quickly, and there is very much a battle of NIMBYism, I guess, they're not in my backyard when it comes to trying to build phosphate rock mines. And again, all the kind of downstream environmental considerations that we need to think about there in terms of phosphoric acid production. There is a lot of gypsum byproduct. That gypsum needs to be stored somewhere. The highest point in Florida in terms of topography is actually at the top of their gypsum stacks. So there's a lot of concerns around the kind of future of liabilities of those as well. That's ultimately meaning that there is less phosphate mined in the US right now. Another area where we see an expansion in production as well is Saudi Arabia. So their kind of Vision 2030 strategy is to be less reliant on oil and pull more resources out of the ground to diversify a little bit, and phosphate is one of those. So since 2011, we've seen Saudi Arabia mining more phosphate and producing more downstream phosphate fertilizers. So we've seen the rise of that country as well in this market. And generally, we see phosphate rock production reaching around 220, 230 million tons by 2027. So we will continue to see an increased volume of phosphate rock being pulled out of the ground, and there is more capacity being built to do so as well. And you can see here, based on the overall capacity for mining phosphate, we actually are only operating at around 70% of actual kind of the amount of capacity that's out there. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a strong incentive for investment right now. Those utilization rates should ideally be higher to incentivize more investment. If we think about phosphate demand and phosphate rock demand more specifically, just a few high-level points to point out here. I said before that we saw in the production chart that China had kind of peaked in 2015. You see that in their demand as well, and we've got that kind of flatlining going forward. They're starting to address the fertilizer application, over application, becoming more efficient. There's still some way to go on that front. But we see China phosphate producers becoming much more diversified and targeting more of these downstream markets, and lithium iron phosphate batteries is definitely one of those. And again, I'll focus on that in a few slides' time. As I said before, the US has become less competitive. Morocco is building more downstream capacity, and that means they're consuming more of their own phosphate rock that they're mining. Russia has increased its phosphate rock demand and phosphate overall fertilizer consumption over the past decade. They are low-cost downstream producers of phosphate. Their phosphate rock mines are higher cost because they're those igneous apatite deposits that I mentioned at the start. But they also have really cheap gas, which means they can produce nitrogen really cheaply. They're big hydrocarbons producers, so they also have a lot of sulfur to use as well. So in the downstream phosphate market, they are very low cost, and we see them with a big presence across the world. And even with everything, the world changing in 2022. And lots of sanctions being applied across many different industries, those sanctions were less prevalent in fertilizers because of its importance in food production. So we've still seen Russia being very active in the fertilizer export market, and they actually exported more phosphate fertilizers in 2022 than what they did in 2021, despite all those disruptions following their invasion of Ukraine in 2021. In March, April 2022. And India is also a big consumer. Obviously, they subsidize their downstream fertilizer production. They're importing a majority of that phosphate rock to do so. We also see more phosphate rock and phosphate generally being consumed in places like Brazil as well. Europe has shrinking demand, and we've seen lots of the downstream fertilizer production facilities in Europe shut down over the last couple of decades. They are importing a majority of their phosphate rock, not all of it, sorry. There is phosphate rock being mined in Finland, for example. But we've seen that kind of stabilize somewhat over the last couple of years. So Europe has definitely a much smaller player when it comes to overall phosphates now than compared to what it was, in 2020, not all that long ago. If we think about some of the demand trends, if we think about the upside, as Dana had kind of pointed out there is under application in markets like Africa. They are consuming nowhere near enough phosphate and other plant nutrients to reach their maximum achievable crop yield. So there's a lot of upside within that, but also a lot of challenges that need to be addressed around the infrastructure and supply chain and general transactions of phosphates. But there's also a lot of growth in developing markets as well. We see a lot of demand growth in countries such as Brazil, and in regions such as Southeast Asia, where we see relatively strong and stable demand growth year after year, 2022 being a bit of an exception due to the high prices. In terms of some of the kind of more stable factors to the demand trends, we do see developed markets are relatively stable. So markets like the US aren't necessarily consuming less phosphate, but they're also getting more and more yields each year on a kind of longer term trend. So the efficiency of phosphate use is increasing quite substantially. And that's a good thing. That's a good story for the industry. We also see phosphate fertilizers being consumed or being kind of manufactured with other micronutrients a little bit more. So phosphate plus sulfur-based, sulfur-enhanced fertilizers are becoming much more popular. We also see other kind of micronutrients that are required by crops, such as boron, magnesium, things like that, we see more of those in the market now. So that's helping to, add a bit of a kind of added value to phosphate fertilizers as well. And of course, we are going to need higher crop yields over the longer run. We aren't going to have as much land to expand on. There's obviously going to be population growth, but there's also going to be growth for crops from other markets as well, particularly as we decarbonize. You look at the potential growth in things like biodiesels and biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels. That's going to add a lot to crop demand going forward, potentially. The jury is still out just how much, but it is ultimately going to mean it's going to be an upside for agricultural production, and that will ultimately mean more fertilizer demand as well. On the downside to demand, and downside I mean thinking about demand trends, what could bring that down? It's not necessarily a downside to overall society. These things are really good. There are new technologies that can unlock unavailable phosphate. So there's a lot of phosphate or phosphorus that's in the soil or in some of these fertilizer products that just aren't being used. It is kind of, there is a chemical limitation. So there's more being done on that front to unlock some of that. And we've actually seen great gains and strides being made when it comes to the downstream feed markets in phosphate feed additives. There's enzymes that are being added to those feed mixes, which is helping to unlock that. So we've seen demand for phosphate contract in that market over the last couple of decades because of some of those technologies. And again, there's some potential within the larger industries for that to happen. There are still many efficiency gains that can be made across the fertilizer supply chain. If you think about the upstream, there's still a lot of losses there. There's also more phosphate that can be extracted from things like mining tailings. So there's some new technologies that are being developed in both the US and Europe that help to get more phosphate out of some of those gypsum tailings, but also other mining tailings, like iron ore mining tailings, for example. So there's a lot going on in that space as well. But also, there's policies to reduce agricultural chemical demand more generally. So I've mentioned that for China already, where they are really inefficient in the way that they use chemicals, chemical fertilizers, but also in places like Europe, where there is the farm to fork strategy, there's some very ambitious goals there of reducing chemical fertilizer consumption. We don't necessarily think those are going to be met, but we do still think that demand in markets like Europe will trend lower. So hopefully that gives a bit of an idea of how we see some of those phosphate demand trends. So when it comes to phosphate rock trade, we've looked at the producers, we've looked at some of that consumption. Let's think about how phosphate moves around the world. And again, we focus on phosphate rock here. We can see here that exports have been relatively flat. There's obviously quite a lot of volatility there. We do see phosphate rock exports increasing somewhat over the next 5 years, but it's been relatively flat. So if you think about that and we think about the overall growing phosphate rock consumption, the amount that's actually traded from a phosphate rock producing country to a phosphate rock consuming country has kind of trended lower and moved down, trended lower, sorry, and remained relatively stable over the last few years at around 15%. So that's kind of reflective of some of those strategies that we've seen in Morocco, who are building more downstream capacity, and rather than exporting phosphate rock, they're exporting phosphate fertilizers or other phosphate intermediates. So that's kind of the main driver there. Now, if we look at who are the exporters right now, there was a big shift in the market in 2022, and Jordan is actually the largest phosphate rock exporter rather than Morocco. Morocco's pulled back a little bit on their phosphate rock exports, focusing a little bit more on fertilizers, but also having a bit of a strategic shift in the way that they value their phosphate at the moment. So that's been an interesting change. Egypt and Peru are large exporters as well of lower grade phosphate rock. Russia, whilst I said they've actually increased their downstream fertilizer exports despite the war in 2022, they have essentially stopped their phosphate rock exports because there was limited consumers of their phosphate rock, and they're mainly European-based consumers, notably Yara and also Prayon in Belgium. So those companies have said, we're not dealing with Russia anymore, so they have had to diversify their rock sourcing. So Russia hasn't been able to export as much rock. And then Togo, Algeria, and South Africa are also other key suppliers into that market. So this should give you some idea of kind of some of the geographic risk, I guess, when it comes to upstream phosphate sourcing. In terms of those import markets, India is the largest by some way. Europe, despite pulling back quite a lot over the last couple of decades, it's collectively the second largest import market. We still see some downstream production facilities in Lithuania and Poland, for example. Also, Yara's facilities in Norway and across the Nordics there are still pulling in a bit of phosphate rock. The US is not self-sufficient in its phosphate rock supply. It imports quite a lot from Peru. So they're also one of the largest importers. And then we see Indonesia, Mexico, and Brazil also being relatively large importers of phosphate rock. So again, hopefully that gives you some idea of how the trade flows in this upstream market work. And again, you can kind of apply your own judgment on some of the risks that apply with those various different countries. When it comes to phosphate pricing, again, just to elaborate a little bit more on what Tana presented before and some more up-to-date data, we do price discovery at CRU, and we collect prices each and every week. So we saw that peak in 2008, that was somewhat matched last year. But since then, we've seen phosphate prices come down rather significantly. They are right now still much higher than the normal average, but we do see phosphate prices coming back lower over the remainder of this year, and really not really hitting another new bottom until 2024. We do think in our price forecasts that the way that the cycles work, the next trough of the cycle will be higher than the previous trough. But we've still got some way to go down with these prices here. So we're looking here at phosphoric acid and then downstream fertilizers and then phosphate rock. One of the interesting kind of dynamics that we've seen open up in the phosphate rock market pricing over this past couple of years is the huge range between higher grade phosphate rock prices and lower grade phosphate rock prices. So with Russia kind of out of the rock market right now, they're one of the higher grade producers. So there's a premium for that higher grade phosphate rock right now. And also with Morocco's strategy of kind of pulling back from the market a little bit, means that there's a big premium that's opened up. And we still in that kind of lower grade component of the phosphate rock market, the rock that's coming from places like Egypt and Peru, Algeria, even Syria, there's still a lot of competition in that market. And we haven't seen prices rear up as much as those higher grade markets. So Just a bit of context on how phosphate is priced and the value of that. So
sorry, Chris, we would have to sort of come to an end soon because
okay.
you're
Yes,
behind time.
I will
Sorry
quickly.
about this, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I haven't kept time very well, so thank you very much for that. So just very quickly, we get a lot of questions right now on lithium iron phosphate. So this is kind of what the flow diagram of that looks like, and why LFP is an interesting battery chemistry, and why it's being used more. We can see that over the long run, we do see LFP demand going up. It's not going to be the dominant battery chemistry, but it is still going to grow rather significantly. And it's not just being used in electric vehicles, it's also being used as an energy store going forward. So that's really it's an important consideration in thinking about future demand here. But do we think this is going to be a big market for phosphates? Not necessarily. We think in an optimistic case that lithium iron phosphate production is going to consume around 9 to 10 million tons of phosphate rock by 2035. So if you put that into the context of a market that is over 200 million tons at the moment, that's still a relatively small share. And if we think about that, most of this is going to be happening in China. That's where most of the LFP cathode capacity is. And we think about some of their broader trends of reducing downstream fertilizer consumption and production. You know, it's essentially going to kind of offset some of that. So whilst there's a lot of interest in this, we don't think it's a complete game changer for the phosphate rock market. And we don't think this is going to kind of pull demand and have too much of an impact on food security. Producers are seeing this obviously as a good thing for diversification of their business, but again, we're not getting too carried away with it based on the calculations that we've done. So to summarize, and apologies again for going over time, phosphate demand is growing both from traditional and new sources, but there's obviously some nuances there that need to be considered, particularly around the efficiency gains that can be made in both supply and demand. We do see new technologies starting to appear, and again, in the context of this forum, that is really where some support for these new technologies can be built. And again, that's both at the supply and demand end of this market. Supply is becoming more diversified. We see producer strategy shifting, the valuation of phosphate shifting as well, and all of that is going to have to continue to be monitored by groups like us, groups like the International Fertilizer Association, but it's important that policymakers also have keeping a close eye on this and trying to have some influence in it as well. When it comes to the ultimate question here of reserves and resources, we aren't particularly concerned about that. There's just been a study that the International Fertilizer Association have released on that shows that those reserves are going to be relatively strong for the coming few hundred years. There are a lot of resources out there that aren't economically viable right now, but can quite easily be. So we don't think we're going to reach peak phosphate anytime soon, and that'll be particularly the case as some of these new technologies are invested in. They help to improve efficiency across the supply chain. So thanks again, everyone, for having me along. Apologies for going over time, and hopefully that has helped your understanding of phosphate markets and how we see things.
Thank you, Chris. Very detailed analysis of phosphate rock market, past, present, and future. And I think there will be many questions in the discussions because you raised many points that are, well, debatable. Maybe there will be something later. So thank you again. We will now continue with the person who is present here, Chris Ludwig. I will briefly introduce him. He has been professor at the University of Amsterdam since 2016. He is involved in circular chemistry and also the co-founder and scientific advisor of SUSPHOS, a pioneering company focusing on upcycling phosphate-rich waste streams. Chris, the floor is yours.
I'd like to start with a shout out to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who really continuously advocates the need for a circular economy. For example, this picture, which was published just prior to the climate conference in Egypt, they highlight like renewable energy is actually only half of the story if you want to succeed and realize the energy transition. because we need to complete it with the circular economy. So batteries, windmills, solar cells, all of the materials needs to be used in a closed loop system. So with that mindset, I like to start my story basically here. So think back a few years, maybe a few more. The key biogenic elements were briefly touched upon by Alessandra. Think of Charles Darwin, describing this warm little pond where carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur came together and life originated. Now, these 6 key elements were important at that time, but they're still essential for sustaining life on planet Earth. My proposition is actually that the exact same 6 elements are now the origin of waste. It can be connected to global major waste challenges, basically highlighted in this cartoon by the 2 bigger waves. But if we go to a bit more scientific picture, that was also discussed in the morning, the picture of the planetary boundaries, that many of these global waste problems can be directly related to these 6 key biogenic elements. And so climate change, it's basically the oxidation chemistry or the redox chemistry of carbon. And at the bottom is the key nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, and where basically the redox chemistry of both is directly related to the origin of the waste. Now, explicitly also quantified last year is the impact of man-made chemicals on the environment, typically in a negative way. So plastics, pharmaceuticals, or herbicides, and so on. And all of this highlights basically we need to change our linear thinking. Now, from this picture, I like to focus on a satellite image of the nitrogen waste problem. I think this picture says more than 1,000 words about the nitrogen waste problem in the Netherlands in particular, because on the left, it shows heavy industries combusting large amounts of fossil to generate heat. They use air, obviously, they need the oxygen, but at the same time, nitrogen is also oxidized. So the industries around Rotterdam, around Antwerp, and the Ruhrgebiet are clearly visible from the air because nitrogen oxides are being formed. And on the right, it basically highlights that the millions of chicken and pigs that also live in the Netherlands in particular, that they don't use the toilets that is in a closed loop system connected to sewage treatment. Now, so this is in the atmosphere. If we focus on the waterways, it's basically a similar picture, but now the phosphates, ammonia, and nitrates are soluble in water. And once a fertilizer, always a fertilizer. So this causes unwanted side effects like eutrophication, as is frequently being discussed. Now, this was highlighted recently in the Observer, but we know the problem for decades. In 1944, it was already published in Nature that mankind actually influences the natural phosphorus cycle. So to me, this means we need radical change. And basically, we cannot solve our current waste problems with linear thinking. We need to apply system thinking and ideally adding circularity. Now, the circular economy was discussed in the morning, and as a concept, I really like it because it isn't too much different than our current linear economy, but it adds to that picture the recovery as well as the recycling. And so these 2 key steps are essential. And also, as Anna Cordell highlighted, the recovery as well as the recycling, they need to talk to each other. The recovered material needs to be suited for recycling, where the recycling produces products that we actually need. So going from linear to circular, the first cycle in the circular economy is actually not too much different. Their resources, if you change from fossil to renewable, it has a big impact. But if you think of producing a lithium iron phosphate battery in the circular economy, the second cycle and the third and the fourth actually has to start from the battery itself, has to start from the product. So we need to shift away from only resource thinking to also fully focus on products and product development, and in particular product design, so that the products are designed to be able to function in a circular economy. Now, this is what we highlighted a few years, and just look at number 7. It's really target the design such that every single product has its function, but also behaves in a circular fashion. Now, to get rid of the linear thinking is actually quite hard, because still at number 1, we mentioned collect waste. In a circular economy, actually, it should say collect a product, and as a last resort, use the waste, but I ideally try to keep the value high and use the products directly in a circular fashion. Now, obviously today, phosphorus is on the agenda, but of the 6 key biogenic elements, phosphorus also has to come first because it's life's bottleneck. Simply no substitute nor replacement, as was of course earlier indicated by Isaac Asimov. Now, starting from the challenges, it's now time to develop the solutions. And with the EU Green Deal highlighting the need for a circular economy and the non-toxic environment, I just want to highlight 2 possible solutions to realize this endeavor. First one is obviously, can we recover and recycling nutrients, in particular with a focus on phosphorus, because there are many products where we actually can design closed loop systems. And the other is actually with a key focus on organic phosphates. And that as a case study, because organophosphates are used, for example, as flame retardants that are quite hard to keep in a closed loop, because they're used in small quantities where it's actually difficult to recycle. So for many specialty chemicals, it's actually needed to design the product such that can actually, if they enter the environment, because of their added to clothing and by washing, it ultimately enters in the environment, that they then have no negative effects and that they can actually degrade and be taken up by the natural cycles. So let's start with the first one, the recovery and recycling of nutrients, where I actually like to look at the red bar, the red flag for phosphorus and nitrogen as an opportunity. Can we look at this as an opportunity, recover the material, create locally resources that we may not have, and at the same time solve an environmental issue? Now, I guess you've seen this picture before, right? Mm-hmm. I like this painting actually a lot because it highlights the start of modern phosphorus chemistry. It's Hennig Brandt, an alchemist discovering the element. He was quite desperate because looking for the philosopher's stone, he was boiling down liters and liters of urine. And because in the flask also it contains some carbon and some silica, the phosphates from urine were reduced and ultimately elemental phosphorus was produced. But I like it also that he advocated, maybe not on purpose, but he advocated the use of a renewable resource to keep phosphates in the cycle. That is basically what he demonstrated. But for some reason, society did not want to scale up this procedure. So we went to the mines, which were also discussed by Chris. This is a picture of the mines owned by OCP in Morocco. And if we keep using the material in a linear fashion, then this is basically the end result. If you think of resource efficiency, it's not so good, but it leads again to opportunities. Because if we can simply recover this at suitable locations and then allow recycling, then we might actually be able to locally generate resources that we currently don't have. So inspired by Hennig Brandt, one way of recovery for phosphorus, phosphate in particular, and nitrogen in the form of ammonia is struvite, which was also briefly discussed in the morning. So it simply needs the addition of magnesium chloride or magnesium oxides, and then the soluble phosphate and ammonia are turned into magnesium ammonium phosphate, which is insoluble and then can be easily recovered. Now we demonstrated this a few years ago at the Dutch Music Festival. So we had the best toilets next to main stage. And with that influx of nutrients, actually, it was still possible to create struvite of sufficient quality to allow recycling. And thinking of recycling, there weren't, at the time when we started, too many technologies that actually used renewable phosphates and create products that we currently need, like the monoammonium phosphates that Chris Lawson just highlighted. And so in our case, we can produce monoammonium phosphate where the ammonia doesn't come from Haber-Bosch, but comes from waste, or the phosphate doesn't come from the mine, but comes from waste. And the magnesium that is needed to produce the struvite can be put back to the wastewater treatment plants to allow the production of new struvite. So also the use of magnesium is circular. Currently, the SUSFAS technology has led to a company that is piloting this procedure, and also now from pilot to a larger scale, there are many activities ongoing. So it's, for me, really amazing to see the development, because we really started this on a Friday afternoon with a few milligrams. And now slowly but surely, this is moving to the kilo or kiloton scale, but let's see how things develop. But at least it really highlights, can we solve an environmental problem? At least try to contribute to solving it by developing new chemistry. So the second example goes now from inorganic phosphates to organic. So let's have a look how we can sustain the phosphorus chemical industry there. So I briefly like to show this picture published by Jan Weigand, also with Willem Schipper here in the office. And on top, it's basically where, if you would like to solve the phosphorus waste problem, the activity should be fully focused on that. Phosphate rock goes to fertilizer, animal feed, food additives, and that yields 90 to 95% of the waste problem. But the chemical industry also uses phosphorus for many important specialty chemicals. And there the typical procedure is that you start from phosphate rock and you go to the element. If we think of organic phosphates, chlorine gas is added to PCl3, then oxidized to POCl3, and ultimately with alcohols, organophosphates are being produced. A lot of redox cycling, waste being generated, and a lot of energy is used at the same time. So for example, the first step, 1500 degrees is needed to convert the rock into the element, in a process similar to the production of steel, for example. So we thought, can we do this different? And this is actually a current ongoing project in the lab, because again, being inspired by the early days of struvite chemistry, because it's highlighted in some of the literature, some of the papers, that struvite could well be one of the key minerals being involved in the origin of life. And so that we could directly convert struvite, inorganic phosphate, into organic phosphates. And so this would be a dream reaction, would be far more efficient than the current industrial procedure. But also it allows the direct use of a renewable input. So hopefully next time we'll be able to tell some future results on this. But there is a catch, because currently some of the organophosphates are detected in the environment, and some others actually show toxic effects. And so you can actually wonder if the use of organophosphates is actually a good thing if you compare it to other, in this case for flame retardants, the brominated. So we started a complete redesign story where we selected one organophosphate that is currently being detected in the environment. And we started a large computational screening just to randomly create lots of molecules, because then we would like to predict and rank their properties. The properties in terms of biodegradability, in terms of toxicity, in terms of environmental fate, in terms of synthesizability. And actually led to a few interesting target structures where now no branched substituents are shown, but linear ones that have the tendency to be better biodegradable, and an interesting ethylene glycol function popped up. So and only then we actually went to the lab and synthesized it and then tested its function, because that's still very difficult to predict. And we found out that actually as a flame retardant, it functions better than the original compound, and also it is biodegradable. But this as a first step really launched a new research line in my group that we really like to do this more often. So now we focus on fluorinated organophosphates. If you look at the elegance, you can clearly identify them as a hazardous structural fragment. And we implemented our ethylene glycol moiety that came from the redesign project I just mentioned. And so ultimately, this could be a very interesting, more sustainable alternative, where the phosphate comes from wastewater. The ethylene glycol can come from the biorefinery. Avancium as a procedure that is currently being scaled up for glucose hydrogenation to 100% atom economy to ethylene glycol. The hydroxy group is needed for increased biodegradation. And obviously, the organophosphate core is still retained because that's needed for its function as flame retardant. Our current ecotox studies show actually that this is indeed a much more sustainable and a very promising alternative to the chlorinated organophosphate. So with this, I hope I've shown you that if we look at the production of our currently needed phosphorus chemicals, there is a large focus on efficient process design, which is important. But to that, I like to add the second pillar, where we really have to think circular, make products more durable or reusable, or recyclable, in any case, more resource efficient. And third, they clearly need to be safe for the environment and obviously for the human health. So with this, I hope I've shown you that we truly need to sustain the use of our 6 key biogenic elements, but need to start definitely with phosphorus first.
Thank you, Chris. I couldn't agree more. Very interesting talk, and also very good to see that synthetic chemistry is still playing a major role in hopefully solving some of the problems. We come to our next speaker. I would like to welcome Andreas Rapp, who is with us today. He is the managing director of Remondis Tetraphos since 2014, and he works in the development of the Remondis Tetraphos process as Remondis Aqua in Hamburg. And now we will hear the more practical side of how to put something that academia is proposing into final technological product. Andreas, floor is yours.
Eva, thank you very much for introducing myself, and I will share the screen. That makes it much easier to explain what I've brought to this meeting. Here we go, and it should also go in full screen mode. Yeah, here we go. So thanks again for my introduction. I would like to introduce Remondis a little bit because I'm not sure if everybody knows Remondis. I can make this smaller. Remondis is not alone in the market, and we have some daughter and sister companies. We are a family-owned company. The shareholder is the family Redman, so completely private. If you sum up all these numbers below, you will see that we have around about 200,000 employees. And yeah, Remondis, the group where I'm working for, is responsible for all the wastewater and recycling business. And then we have Rhinos Logistic in our group. They're doing the worldwide logistic for us. Next part, this is also the part we have started to work for, is Zaria. They are starting at rendering, and they end up at the upper end at producing heparin for the medicine industry. And last but not least, the youngest in the group is Transdev, doing public transport. And to give you a feeling of the size, Transdev is transporting every day more people than Deutsche Bahn and Lufthansa together. So that's quite a big group worldwide. We have some experience in closing material loops. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples for the industrial approach for sustainability. If you look, for example, for waste glass, 885,000 tons of waste glass in our group, replacing 1 million tons of minerals. This is almost 1-on-1. Going to construction waste is even better. It's 1-to-1. 1 ton of construction waste replacing 1 ton of natural building materials. So you don't need sand if you have crushed stones from construction material. Same story is, for example, with gypsum. Gypsum from flue gas cleaning, replacing 1-on-1 natural gypsum from natural mines, 300 tons in our group. This will become a big issue in the near future. We are decarbonizing our industry, and we are shutting down the coal power plants. So the coal power plants are basically the main source for flue gas cleaning gypsum. So we need to find other sources for gypsum, or increase the amount which we take from the natural resource. My goal, talking about phosphate recycling, is that in a few years we have here exactly a new field or another picture of phosphate, how much phosphate we can replace by using sewage sludge ash. I borrowed these 2 pictures from our meeting today, and all of you might know this picture on the right hand side. This should lead us to phosphate recycling in Europe. I fully agree here. Phosphate is yellow in the global perspective. If you would go to a perspective from North Africa, it would definitely not be yellow. It would be green. There is no problem with phosphate. There is enough in our ground. If you go, or if you are located in Europe, from my point of view, it should be red. It's definitely a serious threat. It's a critical raw material. And we have learned this morning from Nicola. We need international cooperation on the political level to save the import for phosphate to Europe. And Dana also talked about all the import countries. We have only 5 countries in the world exporting phosphate. All the others are importing. So from my technical perspective, it's also a question of the supply chain. So worldwide, it's now limited, but still enough. But the supply chains seems to be the important part. A little bit of Corona, a little bit of natural disaster, and easily supply chains can break down, and then we are in trouble. So in Europe, phosphate recycling might be a good idea. And if you look to phosphate or to sewage sludge ash, this comes from our wastewater treatment plants. After importing the phosphate to Europe, and then dissipation of phosphate into the all different kind of applications, the phosphate comes together. It's concentrated in our sewer system, in our wastewater. And after wastewater cleaning, we have the phosphate in the organic substance. And after using the organic substance as renewable resource for energy, the phosphate is in the ash. And good message for all the chemists in the group. The ash is 100% inorganic. Okay, not 100%, but 99.8% inorganic. It comes from an 850-degree flame, so there is no more organic left, and we can really work in the field of inorganic chemistry. If we look deeper into this ash, we see, oh, we have 16 to 24% of P2O5 phosphate inside of this ash. Well, this is the half or almost the same amount like in raw phosphate. That makes it worth doing phosphate recycling from these ash. But we also have 27% of silicium. This is basically sand from wastewater treatment. There is no sand in raw phosphate. So there will be some residues after we have leached the phosphate. And on the other hand, it cannot be used directly as a substitute for rock because there is sand inside. The good message is we have no uranium in sewage sludge ash. Where should it come from? But we have uranium in the rock phosphate, basically from Morocco. The bad message is we have much more heavy metals in the sewage sludge ash. So that's the reason why we should have a proper separation of the pollutant and the nutrient or the material we want to recover, the phosphate itself. So Robert has shown in his presentation the long tradition, and especially at the moment, this is tradition, this is long ago. Today, these heavy metals plus microplastic and medical residues in our sewage sludge and in our sewage sludge ash say that this should not longer be used as a raw material directly for fertilizing our agricultural areas. So better not use it as a material, go for phosphate recycling. And now this brings us to the German legislation. Here, legal framework of sewage sludge. And I like to say that the German government has done something really fantastic. Today, it's allowed to utilize the sewage sludge and the sewage sludge ash directly as a material. So you can put sewage sludge on the field and fertilize the ground, including the heavy metals, including the microplastic, including the residues of medicine, if it fits to the fertilizer regulations, and so on and so on. How to do this is fertilizer regulation and as well as the sewage sludge regulation in Germany. And what we have done, or what the government has done, we haven't changed. I start what they haven't done. They haven't done to change the regulations in some of the articles very, very, very down below at the end. No, they have changed article number 1 in our regulation. The article number 1 says at the moment, or writes at the moment, the law rules the use of sewage sludge as a material. And from 2029, it will say the law rules the recycling of phosphate from sewage sludge. So the material is deleted, no longer possible. So we will talk about phosphate recovery in Germany, no longer about sludge as a material itself. 2003, this year, all wastewater treatment plants in Germany are obliged to report their planned measures to achieve phosphate recycling in 29 and 32. And from this year, they are obliged to measure the peak content frequently by analysis to make everybody aware how much potential is in this sludge. Then in 2029, the bigger wastewater treatment plants, over 100,000 popular equivalents, they have to start. And from the 1st January, they are obliged to do peer recovery if the peak content is above 2%. And let me assure you, it is. They are between 6 to 12%. So every wastewater treatment plant above 100 popular equivalent has to do peer recovery from sewage sludge or from sewage sludge ash. The utilization of the material is not longer allowed. So not into the fertilizer industry, not directly on the fields. 2032, 3 years later, then the smaller wastewater treatment plants are also obliged to do it. 50,000 to 100,000 popular equivalents. The small wastewater treatment plants, they have a small way to do it different. They can utilize the material if it fits to, by meaning of the sewage sludge, if it fits to the fertilizer regulations, and this counts then as peer recovery. Yeah, but the fertilizer regulations are also becoming stronger and stronger year by year. So I expect that, yeah, almost all sewage sludge will go into incineration and will end up as sewage sludge ash in the market. So 2012, we started to develop our own phosphate recycling process. How did that come? Yeah, Mondes in Germany, we are market leader in the sewage sludge business. And yeah, in 2012, this topic, phosphate recycling and we are depending on imports in Europe, popped up. And as the market leader, you should have a way to do it. You should have a solution. So we studied all the existing procedures or the processes for peer recycling, something between 40 to 50 different processes. And the poor result was, from our perspective, the one half of the processes does not work and the other half will never ever be economical, and we as a private company can only work economical. There is no other chance. So failure, no process available. So 2012, 11 years ago, we started to develop the Tetrafos process. We started development from the different way around, not with the ash and how can we get it phosphate out from the ash or the sewage sludge. We started from our experience by the final product. We thought, okay, we need to produce a secondary raw material. This is the overarching goal. We need something that the industry later on will buy, because we need to pay the recycling for the phosphate. So this product should have a constant quality, assured availability, easy. Sewage sludge is every day. Various applications, marketable costs. Yeah, no one buys a secondary raw material if it's more expensive than the primary raw material. Yeah, never ever. And we need some kind of added value. The added value is the recycling aspect. It's from renewable resources. If you remember the presentation of Chris, he has shown you rock. Rock becomes acid, phosphoric acid. And from the phosphoric acid, you produce triple superphosphate, diammonium phosphate, monoammonium phosphate, and the phosphoric acid goes into the industry. So the value chain is rock, acid, and then the final product. So we decided, let's go for phosphoric acid. If we produce something from sewage sludge, from the phosphate, let's produce phosphoric acid, and we have called it Repazit, recycled phosphate acid. This is our brand name. And of course, we would like to have political and regulatory support to increase the acceptance, because we know from our experience it can take years and decades to establish secondary raw material in the industry. Would be good to have someone to push it. So we are talking about phosphoric acid. That's the key basic product in the phosphorus industry. But where to go with it, so where to sell it, and in which kind of quality to produce. If you look to fertilizer industry, the fertilizer industry is using low-grade acid. Yeah, merchant-grade acid. They pay the lowest price. They use the lowest quality. So yeah, this is no fun. Let's go to the industrial applications. The industry is using PPA, purified phosphoric acid, and they are willing to pay much more because they are not trying to have the cheapest price for fertilizer. They are trying to have the highest quality product. So as in our process, and I will show you this in the next slide, our phosphoric acid is circulating, and I'm anyway forced to run or to circulate a high quality, a very clean phosphoric acid the produced phosphoric acid from our recycling process is very close to PPA, to purified phosphoric acid. So my customers for the phosphoric acid is the customer in the industrial application, and this industrial application pays for the recycling of phosphorates. So no, too fast. This is the place where we integrate our process into the wastewater treatment process chain. It starts with a wastewater treatment plant. I like to add with phosphorus elimination. This is obvious in Europe, but if you travel around and you go outside of Europe, this is not mandatory in each and every country. I can tell you a nice story about a very nice business trip to Turkey, only to learn that they are not doing phosphate elimination on the wastewater treatment plant. So failure. From the wastewater treatment process, we receive sewage sludge where the phosphate ends. Then you can dewater it. Sometimes you dry the sewage sludge, and then it goes into our process. And if we talk about Romanus tetraphos, it means two process stages. First is incineration. We utilize the carbon in the sewage sludge for energy. We produce electricity and we produce steam for the wet chemical process later on. And everything happens here inside of the tetraphos plant. We use phosphoric acid, our own phosphoric acid, to solve the phosphates out from the ash. So after that first step, we have some kind of phosphoric acid solution which is enriched with calcium and phosphate from the ash. Then we add some sulfuric acid, and the sulfuric acid is the active substance. The sulfuric acid changes the calcium into calcium sulfate, gypsum, and the proton, the H, goes to the phosphate, and we have more H3PO4 than before. So then it's not only enriched solution, is surplus of phosphoric acid in the solution. Great. We are producing our own phosphoric acid, which we can recycle, and we have to add sulfuric acid. The surplus of phosphoric acid we sell under the brand name Repacit. But as I mentioned in the slides before, also some heavy metals are inside, and also ferric and aluminum is in the ash. And these elements also go into the solution. So we need to have some kind of cleaning step inside. We use an ion exchanger, and the ion exchanger does nothing else than changing an H plus ion against a ferric plus, an aluminum plus, or a heavy metal plus ion. So these ions are then on the ion exchanger, and after a certain time you need to regenerate the ion exchanger, and you do this by the regeneration agent hydrochloric acid. So you put you exchange the ferric and aluminum in the ion exchanger against the H plus from the hydrochloride, and what comes out are metal salts: ferric chloride, aluminum chloride. And this ferric and aluminum chloride is the precipitation agent for phosphate elimination in the sewage plant. So you give it simply back. In the example of Hamburg, at the end of the presentation, we are replacing around about 30% of the precipitant demand of the wastewater treatment plant with this kind of loop. Of course, the gypsum goes into the construction industry, it becomes new gypsum. This is calcium sulfate dihydrat, and then it is mono or half hydrate. So it goes back into the construction business. And the minerals, the sand, lithium oxide, which is left, goes also into as a construction material prospectively. The natural sand is still too cheap that they would use this with, because it's very, very fine particles, and sand is much bigger. So at the moment it goes for landfill. The perspective is in some years maybe we will find someone who will use it as construction material. The gypsum goes to Knauf or Casea, you know, all this Regips, all these big companies using gypsum. The metal salts, they flow back into the wastewater treatment plant to eliminate the phosphate, and the purified phosphoric acid, the pure phosphoric acid goes into the phosphate industry, basically into industrial applications. The proof of ability is to do it. And in 2014, 2 years after starting development the process, so we were still in this chemical part, we found a partner, the city of Hamburg. The city of Hamburg is seeking all the time to find better ways to make more out of wastewater. I just give you one number or two numbers. The wastewater treatment plant in Hamburg is the biggest in Germany, 2.4 million popular equivalents, and they are producing 130% of energy. So they produce 30% more energy than they need for the wastewater treatment process itself. And they had also already 2014 on topic of how to do phosphate recycling. Phosphate recycling is worth doing. And two were looking for a partner, and we found each other, and we decided 2014, okay, let's test the tetraphos process with the sewage sludge ash from the mono incineration at site, and let's build up a pilot plant. So 2015 to 2016, we have run together with City of Hamburg a pilot plant for the tetraphos process. Then we have checked other ashes, or double-checked other ashes on the process since 2018 as well. In 2017 and 18, we have done the basic and the detail engineering for this plant in Hamburg. And by the way, the German law was issued 2017. So Hamburg and Remondes, we have started the detail engineering for this plant even before we were sure that the legal framework will come or not, because we have a business case here. Hamburg has tremendously high phosphate content in the ash. So we started detail engineering, and in 2021, what you see here was ready. This is the final plant, the first full-scale phosphate recycling plant in Germany, designed and operating 20,000 tons of phosphate ash, sewage sludge ash, producing 7,000 tons of phosphoric acid. If you look inside, what you see is 10 years of engineering and around about 20 million euros of investment. But there's also another message. All wastewater treatment plants in Germany have to do this, and they are asking, okay, can we buy the phosphate recycling machine or aggregate? I need to say it's not a single machine, it's not an aggregate, it's a process. And as you can imagine, by seeing all this equipment here inside, it's not easy to handle, to operate this. We're still learning in Hamburg. We are still in the commissioning phase. We are not running full power at the moment. We are at 1 and 2 shift and running the plant. 3 shifts will be by end of the year, and then we are fully in operation. So 2 years of what is it? 2 years of startup, of firing up the plant is a good time. So this is the actual status. This is also our goal, to have this in other cities in Germany, together with the city, with the municipality, to build public-private partnership companies, build up these plans and run together with the municipality phosphate recycling. And the first example here is in Hamburg. We were supported by the German Federal Ministry of Environment. And feel free to ask any question. I'm happy to answer if I can. Thank you.
And we thank you, Andreas. Very impressive to see how things are really put into reality, so how it can work. There will definitely be questions during the discussion later. I would like to come to our last speaker today. We heard a lot about fertilizers, we heard a lot about food security, but of course, and Chris already touched a little bit on that, synthesis and production of phosphorus-based compounds also for other purposes is also important, and there should be sustainability in that as well. I'm very happy to welcome today Jan from the University of Dresden. Jan is professor at Technical University Dresden since 2013, and one of his main research interests is the development of new and sustainable synthetic routes to novel phosphorus compounds and their use in synthetic applications of fundamental and industrial relevance. Jan, we are looking forward to your talk.
Eva, thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you very much for having me and also allowing me to put a little bit different dimension to the topic you touched on today. I'm very pleased about that, and I think it is very, very important for that very important element. I'd like to also add that I'm also affiliated to the Center of the Transformation of Chemistry, which is currently being built as one of the new research centers, big research centers in Middle Germany. And it's going to be dedicated to really do transformation of chemistry. And Chris mentioned that before, that we need to change our perspective, particularly with regard towards how we're going to do chemistry in the future. And what you see here on the picture, I hope you can follow my mouse, is actually a plant which is in the northern part of Vietnam, producing P4. And that is, you can see already, not quite clean or eco-friendly, because parts of the phosphorus is being burned, and you see the smoke coming out of the chimneys, which of course then react with the humidity of the air and is forming phosphoric acid, which I think is one of the main feedstock for almost everything, which I will show you in a few moments. Before I start, I'd really also mention Asimov, because you can read it that life is, of course, absolutely dependent on once it's gone, phosphorus, the element, I mean, there is an inexorable hold which nothing can prevent. So we do have to be very careful with our resources, and I think that had been covered all day long already. Now, if you're looking into a paper from 2017, which suggests prebiotic routes towards certain phosphorus compounds, particularly orthophosphates, or to show how the interconversion of phosphate or phosphate solubilization or urea-mediated phosphorylation, if you follow these colors here, then there is, of course, something very interesting which comes down here, which shows you possibilities maybe how we can directly use phosphates in order to produce interesting basic chemicals, and particularly, and that counts for Europe, prevent or secures the production of certain basic chemicals, since there is no P4 production in Europe anymore, since Tamphos filed bankruptcy like 2012, I believe was the year. So we have a problem here, particularly with respect to some fundamental compounds, phosphorus compounds. Now I'd like to go back, of course, to the main phosphate ore, and that has been mentioned all day long. It's the apatite. But this, and I'd also like to show you the northern part again, because Dana at the beginning also mentioned that in different areas the mining of phosphate ores has different impacts, and this is one of those mines in the northern part of Vietnam, in Lao Cai. And you can see what happens after you finish with the mining. Here you see really nice, almost quality 1 phosphate ore. And then in the end, you're just going to fill the previous rainforest with water. And that is, of course, catastrophic for the environment. I also would like to show these effects on certain areas in the world, which may not be able in the future to maybe get from different countries phosphate rock if required. Although this has been shown by Chris before, the oxidation states are quite significant, and we've been hearing about the phosphoric acid. Come back to this in a moment. But I think two very important compounds are PCO3 and P4. One of the modification of phosphorus, the only molecular form, if you do not count P2 as a allotrope of that element. Now, the wet process, you all know this, and I'd also would like to mention this because many of those industrial processes are coupled to other elements as well. And therefore, we need to look into the wet process a little bit more in detail because it starts, of course, with the production of sulfuric acid. And I don't want to hold that back, that 80% of the world's sulfuric acid is a byproduct of fossil fuel production. Cutting back on coal, oil, and natural gas means producing less sulfuric acid. That's important as sulfuric acid is critical to make fertilizers as well as green technology like solar panels or batteries. You all know that. And what that means is P chemistry depends on fossil fuel resources as well. And therefore, important rethinking is also required. And we'll come back to this also with another element when I quickly touch on the recycling of some battery materials. Now, the second part of the wet process is the so-called reaction with sulfuric acid, giving us the gypsum as seen before. You see some pictures as it is done, for example, in Vietnam. And coming now to the most important compound for the industrial use is, of course, P4. And P4, of course, has some problems. I show you also some pictures which I took myself at that industrial site. Again, you see the impact on the environment. This is a Söderberg electrodes. Here's the tapping of the slag, which also is a little bit of an issue because we have to get rid for this, and of course, liquid P4. Now you may ask yourself, why is it so important? Yeah, why is P4 so important? Because it is the entry point of the phosphorus tree. Chris showed that before as well. And also most of the phosphate or secondary phosphates being used for animal feed, food additives, fertilizer for agriculture, it is very important that we also look into the chemistry for industrial use of phosphate / P4 and the follow products. Because all these products here are heavily depending on this red row. And as it has been stated before and pointed out, it is a chlorine-based synthesis. We do have multiple steps in the synthesis. There are toxic reagents. And of course, there at the moment, there is no real P recovery. And we do form a lot of waste. And of course, if we talk about waste, nowadays, waste should be rather seen as an opportunity, as a resource rather than waste. And therefore, we should look into this. And we have been working on that topic, particularly finding new ways of P chemistry almost the last 15 years. And I think there are possibilities and opportunities which I'd like to show you what we could do or what the future could develop into in order to, first of all, not being dependent on P4 chemistry or PCl3, and maybe also not using redox detours where we have to reduce the phosphorus in the oxidation state 5, go back to 0, and then you reoxidize in the end to, for example, as Chris also showed before, making phosphates. Now, giving that perspective, it is also very interesting to note that P4 itself, a PCl3, is only required to make certain chemicals. And therefore, they are more or less useless, not from a fundamental point of view. We do love to work with these materials, but from an industrial point of view, they are hazardous, they're problematic to deal with. Particularly in Europe, it is not available. You have to ship it either from China, Vietnam, or from other sources. And there are indeed harsh problems. I'm not touching on pH3 today. That is a topic by itself, but also that would be something for the future to talk about. Now, P in synthesis, just giving you some name reactions, because it is important to put it into perspectives and into some very important reactions, which are key in order to make fine chemicals or products. And without those reactions and without phosphorus, those ones would not have been possible. And you see, for example, the Michaelis-Abursov reaction, which converts a phosphate into a phosphorus 5 compound. And then we have the Staudinger reaction, where you can make primary amines via an azide route. And you have the Wittig reaction, which implements a CC double bond, and you can make olefins, very important, particularly for the synthesis of vitamins. And you see every reaction so far has as a key component a phosphorus derivative. And I'd like to end also with a very important reaction, the upper reaction, which is important to convert alcohols to certain products and alcohol halides, for example. Now, coming back to the problem, this is, I would say, state of the art. And well, the production of white phosphorus is about a megaton per year. And the process you see here shows that you use carbon as a reducing agent, and you add silicon to it in order to make silicates. And as an exhaust gas, you get carbon monoxide. Now, the state of the art is, of course, important to make these compounds here. And I'd like to focus on this a little bit, because all of these compounds, like a material which you need for the production of beta-carotene, like vitamins, comes from PCl3. Lithium hexafluorophosphate, I will mention this a little bit later, just shortly, also comes from PCl5. So the oxidation of PCl3 with an excess of chlorine gas gives PCl5. You have an ester here, triethyl phosphate, which is a flame retardant and typically being used in certain kind of foams, or it's being used as the plasticizer, and nobody is really taking care of that. And so far at the moment, if you dispose of foams, that material also ends up in any kind of landfills or or it's going to be burned in the end. Indium phosphide stems from pH3. And precursors for pharmaceuticals, such as the butyl phosphate here, is derived from phosphine oxide, which comes from the oxidation or the burning of white phosphorus. Glyphosate, you all know the story about that, comes again from PCl3, and I'd like to also end this with a catalyst, or also a phospholipid for the synthesis of mRNA vaccines. And all these compounds stem directly from the P4 production. Now, if we talk about alternative and sustainable resources for phosphorus, the state of the art is, of course, outdated. The chemistry we are looking at is 100 years old, and not much effort has been done so far to change the way we're looking into phosphorus chemistry, particularly on an industrial scale. And I mentioned already that the P4 production in Europe does not exist anymore, and therefore we need alternative synthetic strategies and alternative value chains. And therefore, we are working in my group particularly on these 4 research priorities, which we define as modern phosphorus chemistry for the short and midterm, and I will end up with a long-term perspective to give maybe an idea of what can be done in order to really use this element phosphorus in a more sustainable way. First of all, of course, alternative P chemistry, and we've added to this already some nice, interesting contributions over the last years. We are particularly providing, or we worked on alternative P1 precursors, which can directly be derived from the element phosphorus, white phosphorus. And so that would substitute chlorine-based PCl3 chemistry. And we've been quite happy that most of the heteroatom bonding to phosphorus is being possible with this new way where you transform P4 into these kind of derivatives, whether it is amines, phosphites, or even phosphines. Now, if we come to recycling spent material, alternative value chains, of course, we have heard this all day long, and a very nice process, a recovery of phosphorus from waste streams, which is, of course, still in progress. And we just heard the nice talk from Raimondis, that sewage, sludge, industrial wastewaters can be used. And I put this here in green because phosphoric acid is, for me, one of the most interesting material for further use, which I'll show you in a moment. But all the other salts which have been mentioned today are very important. And of course, some processes that are being currently developed or companies working on, like tetraphostruvia, Nuresis, phosphogreen, or Ricophosphus, phosphoparphos, to be mentioned here, are very, very important. And in particularly also for realizing particular fertilizer production. But we should also look a little bit, if it particularly goes to the recycling with respect to industrial application and not for fertilizer application, in alternative value chains, such as electrolytes and additives for spent batteries, for example. We have lithium hexafluorophosphate or hydrogen phosphate, lithium salts, or lithium iron phosphate. Or if you look into plastics, particularly the phosphorus-based flame retardants or plasticizers from plastics, which are, of course, in multi-ton scale now in the environment by being implemented in certain products. And so what we're doing in our group and what we're really focusing over the last 10 years is extraction purification, so recycling, reuse, particularly also with respect to remove additives and flame retardant from certain foams, for example, so that you purify the foams to put them into a chemolysis and again to make monomers for certain foam formation afterwards, so that you also can recycle the foam, which requires actually to remove all these additives, which actually would hamper your chemolysis process in the end. And again, chemical utilization, phosphoric acid as a secondary P resource stemming from certain waste streams is for us particularly attractive. Show you one example, which we've done. Secondary resources, particularly with the recovery of lithium and phosphorus from lithium-ion batteries. And we've been doing this whole the black material, which is the lithium iron phosphate cathode material. We managed to leach this in a way that we completely remove the iron phosphate. And then we're looking into lithium extraction, where we are specialized in making new receptors, particularly able to extract lithium compared to other metals. And then in the end, you can re-extract the phosphoric acid. So in that case, there is a complete recycling of the whole material, and you can use this again to fabricate, if you want, lithium iron phosphate. Now we extended this a little bit to stoffliche Wiederverwertung von Elektrolyt, Leitsalzen und Lösungsmitteln, material recycling of electrolyte conducting salts and solvents, particularly with a focus on improving access to battery materials in Europe by providing secondary recyclates from cost-efficient processes or reducing the dependency along the battery value chain on non-European supply through circular material cycles and optimizing the ecological footprint in lithium-ion cells. That is particularly important since the electromobility will be one of the very important parts of the energy mix. And I personally believe that we cannot rely on only one part. We have to have an energy mix. And particularly here, we see the close connection to another very important element, fluorine. Lithium iron phosphate, hexafluorophosphate, that will also be a problem also for the future, because if we're going to rely on these kind of batteries, you're going to form multi-tons of lithium PF6 salts, which in the end needs to be recycled as well. Okay, slowly coming to an end. Phosphate conversion. This is something which I'm quite happy because this work is now, we developed this more than 10 years and has been now accepted also for Nature Synthesis, and we filed 2 patents. And what it essentially is that we can use primary as well as certain secondary phosphates in nice conversion reaction, which I will show you on the next slide, to generate a P5 transfer reagent, which can be used for phosphorylation reactions. And Chris also mentioned before the production from screwite, for example, into certain phosphate esters, organic or organophosphate esters is quite important. We could already show and file also a patent for this, that you can use also used spent phosphate esters, either they be from extraction strategies like 2D EPA, which you see here. This is a typical extractant agent, which when you finish the extraction, you want to get rid of it. So now we can convert also those esters or the triacyl phosphate, which are introduced as a flame retardant already, to these transfer reagents. That can be used in the follow-up to make new kind of phosphate esters, chiral catalysts or biorelevant phosphates, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. That is the old process where you convert P4 into PCl3, you oxychlorinate, and then you can do the alcoholysis reaction, make your phosphate esters. So the question was, can we directly just deoxygenate the phosphate with the presence of certain anhydrides and the ligand to make this very interesting alternative P5 precursor? The one way would directly go from inorganic phosphate, and the other way works exactly the same if you use organic phosphate esters and do kind of an upscaling in order to make these alternative precursors. We've done several ones of those. You see here bipyridine derivatives and the dimethyl aminopyridine derivatives, and you can make them already in the lab on a 100-gram scale, and we are scaling these currently up. So what you can do with this, you can utilize this as a PO2 synton, adding, for example, you can do ligand exchange, you make mixed substitution, you can make charge reversed aminophosphates, which are quite important materials in material science, for example. You can make new bond motifs, and maybe a little bit more interesting is modified biomolecules like nucleotides, natural phospholipids, and chiral acid catalysts, which stems in a two-step reaction directly from phosphoric acid. So we completely prevent in this stage the usage of P4 as an intermediate. We do not need to reduce the phosphate into P4. We do not do an oxychlorination or chlorination to make intermediates, which then in alcoholysis reaction will give you the corresponding products. These are more or less one-pot reactions, and these compounds are typically received in large quantities and good yields. Now, finishing up with the large part, and this is, as I mentioned before, something perspective or an outlook for the future. And we are certainly not the first people who looking into this kind of chemistry, which has been recently also published by Christopher Cummins from the MIT. Let's make white phosphorus obsolete. I think I showed you that we are already there. And the future will be that we do have, particularly for industrial chemistry, chlorine and P4-free phosphorus chemistry from secondary resources. And what we're currently doing, and this is ongoing research, and I'd just like to give you a small perspective on this. We are converting, and you've seen this already, phosphate into phosphorus 5 reagent. And now we're going to modify our synthesis into a combination of synthetic and electrochemical approaches so that the reagent in the end is not a chemical reagent, that the reagent will be like electrons. And then, of course, with electrons and electrochemistry approach, we also want to alter the oxidation state, since certain compounds need to be in the oxidation state 3, such as catalysts, phosphines, for example, in order to also have fine chemicals for certain application in industry. So in the end, thank you very much, and I hope I could show you also a little bit on a more specialized topic of P chemistry, that this is very important and that there are new approaches available already, which are in the course of sustainability and recycling of P4, the very important element of life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan, for expanding the topic to everyday products of phosphorus, and for showing us that synthetic chemists can also play a very important role in sustainability. And last but not least, happy birthday, Jan. Thank you for joining us on your birthday.
Thank you.
And with this, I would like to hand over to Floris, who is going to chair the discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. So the lecture took a little bit longer, but we still have 20 minutes for this panel discussion, and all the afternoon speakers already agreed to participate, and I also invite the morning speakers that are still around here to also participate in the discussion. But one person who is in the afternoon panel and hasn't spoken yet is Dan Egan, the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, as well as The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance. So he's a science journalist. He's also a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. So not a journalist, but writing very interesting books about phosphorus. And then, since you haven't spoken yet, I would like to start with some questions from your side that we can discuss in this panel discussion. So one of the questions that you raised was, can you talk about the phosphorus paradox? And maybe you could briefly explain what you mean with this phosphorus paradox, and so that we can discuss the...
Sure. Yeah, it was very interesting listening to Dana's presentation today, talking about the looming limitations of phosphorus availability, when just yesterday I spent a long time on the phone with some people in Florida who are bracing for another horrible algae season. Lake Okeechobee in the center of Florida used to be the heart of the Everglades. It used to be the wellspring of all this fresh water pulsing down the Florida peninsula, but because of heavy agriculture use and human settlement, that giant lake, it's round and about 30 miles in diameter, is now a petri dish to grow microcystis, toxic blue-green algae. And the state of Florida is spending billions of dollars to build water capturing systems so they don't have to send this polluted water to the coasts when the lake level gets too high. So that's the paradox right there. The idea that there's too much phosphorus in this lake, and the state of Florida, along with the US federal government, are going to be spending billions of dollars to capture and somehow try to passively treat this toxified water, at the same time that 2 hours away in a place called Bone Valley, Florida, which is really the heart of the US phosphate industry, they're on pace to run out of their reserves in 3 or 4 decades, maybe sooner. So the paradox is we're running out of the stuff at the same time that we're arguably squandering it through overuse and through lack of ability to capture and reuse.
Would like to comment, Alessandra.
Thank you very much for phrasing it in such a clear way of a paradox. And I think that one question that comes over and over, and that I would like to pointedly ask to Chris Lawson, if he's still available, is how do we make a difference between a demand, which you have presented, and a need? Can we make a difference between how much we need of phosphorus and what is the demand, and what is the difference between these two concepts?
Yeah, well, I think the difference really is that it's the efficiency that we talked about, and as I tried to highlight, there is plenty of room to improve efficiency across the whole supply chain. As I say, there is still a lot of phosphorus that is underutilized within the soil, and there are emerging technologies that can help to unlock some of that. So I think that really is where the answer lies. And of course, there is also those efficiency measures that can be made to reduce some of those losses and get some more circularity in the upstream end of the supply chain as well. So I think there's quite a few potential solutions there to help address that difference between what is the actual need and what is the demand. And like I say, that's where I think that groups like this can really focus their efforts on.
Yeah, but when you talked about this, that actually means shrinking your market. How that is maybe also why on your slide it's presented as a downside. Mm-hmm. I understand that it's a downside in trend, but it's also a shrinking of your market. How do you process this in your way of thinking this? Isn't that a risk for you?
It is definitely a risk, and we do. I think the phosphate producers see this as a risk, and they are also actively investing in partnering with some of these companies that can do so. So we increasingly see some of the larger fertilizer producers looking at becoming more integrated in the downstream and offering farmer solutions. You look at the way that a company like Yara has evolved over many years. It's more about offering a solution than just offering bulk commodities. So we may see that kind of strategic shift with lots of these companies going forward. Even OCP, the largest phosphate miners and the within Morocco, which has all those 70% of reserves, they're investing very heavily in kind of agricultural technologies and have lots of different innovation streams to help with some of that going forward and to ultimately monetize some of those new technologies as well. So I do think there are there are some changes that are happening there. You could quite easily be skeptical as well and say that, you know, they may be investing in these things to somewhat, you know, potentially hold them back a little bit and get an understanding of how these technologies are working. But I think that we don't necessarily need to think like that. And we can take some confidence that, you know, these larger companies are actually taking an interest in some of those technologies.
Do those answers satisfy you, Dan?
Me? I guess what I'm thinking about right now when is I'm in the US, I'm thinking about the US ethanol policy and the fact that there's a real demand for phosphates to fertilize these corn crops, but these corn crops in the US, 40% of them go to alternative fuels, go to ethanol. And so that's a head scratcher when you think about using it takes a lot of energy to grow these crops, but it also takes a lot of fertilizer that we're going to need for future generations. You know, whether the horizon is 30 years or 300 years, and I tend to think it's closer to 300 years, that doesn't matter really, because when did Hennig Brand discover phosphorus? That was probably 300 years ago, right? I mean, we're moving along here pretty fast, and I think there's a lot of hard decisions that need to be made. But I would argue that one that isn't that hard is to revisit here in the U.S. the ethanol policy, because that's a lot of fertilizer we could bank and use for future generations. And that's the thing about the industry. All that stuff's going to get used. It's a matter of using it in a way that's going to sustain the population that we have today and not foul our waters, because the only thing we need more than food is water. And we've had cases here in the United States where we've lost water systems due to microcystin pollution, due to microcystis, which is driven by agriculture runoff and the phosphorus in it.
Yeah. So the other question you raised then, or one of the other questions was, is there any reason for optimism?
Yeah, well, you know, I spent 3 years working on this book. It's not a big book. It's 240 pages. And, you know, a lot of days I came home a little dejected, but I think we have to find optimism where we can find it. And I think for me, that's public awareness, because we've gotten so good at farming and extracting the phosphates we need to do this modern agriculture that people don't think about it at all. And it's only here in the US, it's starting to dawn on people who live near chronically algae-plagued lakes. They're starting to connect the dots. And again, I don't want to disparage the industry or agriculture. You know, a lot of people, you know, have problems with so-called factory farms. I'm agnostic. I don't care what size the farm is, but I do care that they start using that manure as, you know, an asset rather than a waste. And, you know, looking at some of the history that I plumbed for the beginning of this book and the lengths that the British were going to get phosphorus, to get fertilizer. I mean, they would see a modern factory farm sewage lagoon not as a big pile of yuck, but more like yum. You know, they would see the food, the value in that. And that's what we have to get the public to see. And that's where I have some optimism, because you know, this is a problem that isn't going away, and it goes back to the paradox. It's A, we're running out of it, and B, we're overusing it to the point that sometimes many of our waters aren't swimmable, fishable, and sometimes even drinkable with treatment.
Yeah, so you are writing books with which you draw attention to the problem. What else can we do as scientists? What can we do as European Chemical Society? What is needed to grow this awareness? And well, it's not only a question that's to all the panelists, I would say. I don't really feel like I'm in a position to tell a room full of such smart people, and specifically smart people about phosphorus, what to do. But I think it's the communication to the public. That's everything. And the plant in Hamburg, the Remondis phosphorus recovering plant, that's a great story. It's so good that I went over there and took a tour of it.
in 2019. Then I also, it wasn't too far, took a tour of the battlefield of Waterloo, where the bones were harvested in the 1800s for their phosphorus. And so they recognized, they intuited the circle of life even back during the savage days of the Napoleonic Wars, and we need to reconnect in that way. And so my advice, I guess, is to and who knows, I mean, maybe the Remondis system doesn't pan out, but it seems like it's working out pretty well. And that's a good story for people to hear, that the answer isn't always the rocks in the ground. It's just what we deal with every day.
I like to add
Andreas,
I like to add something. I mean, the sewage sludge ash in Germany has the potential to replace 50 to 60% of the phosphate imports in total. And the owner of this ash are the municipalities. So if they would start the projects like in Hamburg, we could tackle the challenge of phosphate recycling. I'm pretty sure that industry will not build recycling plants by chance if they later on get the ash or not. So the owner is the municipalities, and we and other companies are happy to start public-private partnership to do this kind of recycling. We see one way how to do it in Hamburg.
Yeah, you were both at the same time.
Okay, just like to add a few words because we've just seen that there's a functioning process in Hamburg. This is a real challenge for ingenuity. It's a way out of part of this problem. We've also heard a rather, I think, modest investment sum, and I'd just like to add that if taxes on sewage are raised by 1%, then you can recycle all the phosphate you have. And actually, in Switzerland, they had a referendum on it.
Agreed.
95% of the people said, of course, we'll pay 5 francs a year to make it happen. And the government explained it really well. You should look at the documentation. It's fantastic. Everybody said, of course, for such an important thing, we'll pay 5 francs a year extra. No problem. And then it happens. So it's actually quite easy if you explain it to the public. And so if you ask if people are positive, this is a positive message, I think.
No, I've got the same. In principle, what for the future to grow, I think it's part of it is legislation. Make sure that the products that come out of the recycling are allowed to be reused. I think there's a lot of legislation at the moment where prohibits some of the phosphorus sources to be reused. Now, talking again about the rendering plants, for example. I think also in the US there are a lot of plants at the moment on struvite already. I think Ostara over there is having a lot of plants at the municipalities and trying to, but selling it to getting it to the farmers over there is more of a difficult issue. Sometimes also about the volumes they produce. They're too small to get that done. I think one of the things you see, even though that's strange, but Ostara in the US is building a new plant which is producing a synthetic struvite in order to help them to sell the recovered struvite. So in order to create a market, you sometimes need to build a synthetic market and then just take it over with the recovered version. And I think it's also one of the things that's being done there is, okay, try to create a market for a relatively new product like struvite. It's been difficult, but I think there's some rolling coming on over there.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, obviously monitoring those kind of technologies and companies like Ostrava, I think, if we think about the end use of phosphates, which is predominantly in agriculture, farmers have a lot of decisions to make, and they have a lot of it all ultimately comes down to costs and efficiencies at the end of the day, and we've got to get the economics right with this and get the communication around the economics right. So what can help to bring down a farmer's cost and make things most efficient, and what can they get a financial benefit from as well, whether we start to consider things around carbon credits or credits for avoiding certain emissions and things like that. So I think that thinking in that way can certainly help to get some more offtake or get some more kind of generate some more interest in this space, because we're unlikely, very, very unlikely to see farmers looking to use different types of products because they might eventually get a premium for the corn or wheat or something like that they've produced, because that is unlikely. I don't think farmers see that as realistic. So it's all about bringing down those costs and improving the efficiencies.
Yeah, and so we heard different examples. The Swiss, they have a referendum, so everyone can vote. In the Germans, they oblige to recycle the phosphate from the sewage. Other countries don't do anything. So what is a good? Do we have to go to obligations, or how is that in the US, for example? No obligations, I guess.
One of the big problems in the United States is the Clean Water Act, ironically. That was passed in 1972, and it largely left agriculture untouched because it was designated as a non-point source pollution, and the Clean Water Act went after the point source polluters, and that's basically people with smokestacks and pipes, because you can plug or scrub what's coming out of those tubes. You can't really take a squeegee or a broom to a landscape and clean it similarly. So at the time, the farms were a small enough scale, and the livestock population, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was deemed at the time to be, a problem, but not the problem. So agriculture was largely left alone. 50 years down the road, the picture of farming in the United States has changed dramatically. And some of these farms now have up to 10,000 head of cattle. And, as I mentioned earlier, there's opportunities there, because one of the first rules of waste management is getting your hands on it, consolidate it. And the farmers, wittingly or unwittingly, have already done that. And so it is arguably, those sewage lagoons are arguably point source polluters now. Another thing that, talking about looking for optimism or advice, it's the idea that, farmers they're not going to do something voluntarily. I understand, or most of them won't, and I understand that, but, it's going to take laws, and that those laws will hopefully level the playing field so they're all competing, fairly with each other. But what's not being considered right now is in the ledgers are the ecological costs, because milk here in the United States is relatively cheap, but the price isn't just what comes off your debit card. It's going to the beach on the beach that you grew up on a summer day, and you can't swim in it. And these are real costs that the public doesn't really consider, because the dots have yet to be connected. And that's where I hope this is headed, or greater public awareness.
Anyone else who wants to add something? So I think this is also a good moment to come to a close, also with these conclusions. Yeah, thank you very much for participating then in this discussion. I must say that I enjoyed the entire day very much. I also learned a lot, I must say. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I would like to give the word again to Eva to formally close the day.
Thank you, Floris. The last discussion was a bit shorter than we had anticipated, but we are trying to answer all the questions that we collected in the chat individually later. So that being said, I would like to thank all of you for being here with us today. I think we heard a lot of new information, some that you already knew, different perspectives, different aspects. Phosphorus, the devil's element, then it's definitely not. It's the element of life, but of course we know why some people call it the phosphorus, the devil's element, but we love it. So some of us love it and we need it. Without phosphorus, there is no life as we know it. But then we heard about phosphogeddon, and this is something that is caused by mankind. It is our responsibility to deal with these things in a responsible way. And I think we heard by many people that we have to raise public awareness, that we have to include the stakeholders, that we have to talk to the end users, that we have to communicate with the general public. And as you said then, if you go to the beach or if you see something is not as it used to be 30 years ago, maybe then people realize. I always tell people, just look at what is in your smartphone. If phosphorus is no longer available, you won't have your smartphone. You can tell them there is no food. Some people will not listen, but if you tell them there is no smartphone, then they might listen. But this is not the right way because we know phosphorus is important. Is there enough? Well, we raised this question this morning. I think we have different viewpoints. Some people say there is enough, others say there might not be. So Dana showed this very interesting scale, 10 billion people to feed. With the phosphorus resources, it might be possible, it might not be. But she had a very interesting approach using other alternatives to recycle phosphorus. And then, of course, we all know that when you talk about, well, the excrements, or when you talk about sludge, these are words that people do not really want to hear. And I think this, what some people brought up, to just use different words, use the word renewable fertilizer. Sounds so nice. And sometimes it's really just in how you put things, in what perspective you put them, to really convince people that something is good and is useful. And we are convinced that it is. Remondis Aqua has already gone the way in Germany. Other companies will follow, have to follow, because the legislation in Germany and in other countries is getting there. And so this is recycling. But of course, we also learn that when it comes from sludge, it might not be as good as the real stuff. Even though the real stuff is also contaminated with heavy metals, still the one coming from sludge might even be purer. And so maybe you also have to find a way of selling this, of upcycling, not only recycling, using the phosphate recovered from waste for something else. We heard about the lithium iron phosphate batteries. These are there, they are there. And we also heard the demand, how much is going to be required for cars to be used. Yeah, and so maybe if these are better connected, if we are really going the way to a circular phosphorus economy, in the way industrial waste to something that is useful for industry, but also involving the synthetic chemists, because what we are looking at, of course, is a big picture: fertilizers, food security, mobility. But there are so many other products based on phosphorus that we should not forget. And especially the academic people in the phosphorus community, they are or the people that we need to talk to. And Jan, I think you have convinced many of us that this is the way to go. Periodic table of the endangered elements. You remember that this was really the starting point. Need we change the color of the element phosphorus? And before we started this workshop, my answer would have been, yes, we need to. But then something very important came up. And that was that it really depends on the view. If you go to Morocco, there is no phosphorus problem. They have enough. If you go to Europe, where we have to import it, there is a phosphorus problem. And so maybe there has to be more than one periodic table, also focusing or taking these different views into consideration. And then what we also discussed in between today is that, of course, we are always looking at the Western world, at a world that is well-fed, that is not malnourished. And so probably when we would consider social aspects, a lot of our discussions would have gone quite a different way. But this is something for another time, for another workshop. For today, I think we have found some answers. We have not really found an answer for the element and what color it should be, but this is going to be discussed later. Thank you all again for joining us today, for speaking with us, for speaking about our favorite element, phosphorus. For those who are attending online, thank you then for joining us. And I can only tell everyone it's a great book. It starts with a very good story in Florida, so go and read it.
Thank you.
Safe trip back home for those of you who have to go back home, and hope to see you again in person at another event. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.